Okay. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 11th Annual Wild Wisconsin Winter Web Conference. I am Jean Anderson with the South Central Library System, and I am moderating the Reference and Readers Advisory track. Assisting me today is Angela Schneider with the Winnifox Library System. We are so glad that you are here with us today. Our presenters for this session are Leah Dudak, Dr. Rachel Ivy Clark, and Marissa Kaiko with Syracuse University School of Information Studies, who will be discussing reference repertoire. You know more than you know. So I think, Leah, you're running the slides, so I'll let you go ahead and get started whenever you're ready.
Yeah,
thanks everyone for joining us. Super excited to have you here today. I'm Rachel Clark. I'm glad to be joined by Leah and Marissa to talk about a project we've been working on for about a year, exploring the concept of repertoire in reference. This kind of got started for me, the idea. I saw this meme floating around the internet a couple of years ago in some library communities, this quote from Alan Smith that in order to be really good as a librarian, everything counts toward your work. Every play that you go see, every concert that you hear, every trip you take, everything you read, everything you know. I don't know of another occupation like that. The more you know, the better you're going to be. And I suspect this resonates with most of us, but my beef with this quote is the part where it says, I don't know of another occupation like this. So I actually know of another field that is exceptionally like this, and that's the field of design. So there's been a lot of interest recently, and specifically, I'm actually very interested in this space at the intersection of librarianship and design. So I don't know how many people have heard of design thinking or noticed it in recent years, but it's become increasingly of interest in the library community. Stephen Bell's written a lot about applying design thinking in academic libraries, Linda Braun in school libraries. Lots of other folks are using design thinking. I believe Leah is also going to speak tomorrow about the Urban Libraries organization using design thinking to explore how to address trauma in libraries. So it's becoming increasingly popular. One thing that I've noticed looking at design in librarianship is that some of this work really highlights what I would call specific aspects of design. Like we think about design in these concrete ways. So we tend to think about it sometimes as the design of a physical space or the design of an experience. And that is all entirely valid, but design is actually a bigger thing than just space or just experience. So I want to talk a little bit about design itself and then talk about the ways that it intersects with librarianship. So when I talk about design, this is sort of what I often get from most people, that design is this mysterious activity. It's magical. A designer just has an idea that comes out of nowhere, this aha moment, and creates this design, right? We're sort of taught these urban legends of, Steve Jobs designed the iPhone. That is absolutely not true, right? The iPhone was developed by a huge team of people, and it wasn't just somebody waking up in the middle of the night with a good idea. Obviously, somebody had to have an idea somewhere along the line. But what I want to do is actually sort of open this black box and talk a little bit more about all of these components that go into design. So then we think of design, we think of, fashion design, graphic design, all of these maybe applied design fields, but design is actually its own discipline. Design scholars have identified this common set of fundamental principles. I call them elements of design epistemology, and that just basically is a big fancy word for how do we know what we know, and from the perspective of design. Design is a little bit different, right? We think about science, and traditionally we are a library science. Science is about observing the world and sort of trying to answer questions and predict what might happen next. Design is actually about creating solutions to problems. So identifying problems in the world and then building things that try to address those problems. I don't always say solve because they don't always solve the problems. Sometimes they actually create new problems, but attempting to address these problems. And that's sort of the fundamental difference between science and design, that we create a thing. A thing could be a physical thing. It could be a new chair in your library, but it could also be an intellectual thing like a classification system. It could be a digital thing like a database. And this is what librarians are doing, right? We are creating things that are trying to help people address their information problems. Now, design often focuses on what we call wicked problems. These are problems that are very challenging to solve. These are social problems, right? So in librarianship, I think a good example of a wicked problem is something like, how do we address low literacy rates and increase literacy in the population? It's a very interconnected problem. There's a lot of sort of social, economic, political factors involved in that are very hard to untangle, and that there's not one solution to that problem. There's many different ways that we can address it. In design, we're also interested in sort of problem finding, framing, and reframing. That's the idea that there isn't that one way to solve that problem. And if we look at it from a different perspective, we might come up with a different solution. And because design is about problem solving, it also always has this emphasis on service, which I also think aligns with librarianship, that librarianship is at its heart a service profession and that we're trying to help people. Design is about making those things. That's how knowledge happens in design. And one of the main ways that we're going to talk about today is this idea of building a repertoire. So we'll go into that in a little bit more depth on the next slide. But that is one way that we actually create knowledge in design and in design fields. We use iterative processes. Again, we try something, we see if it works. Whatever doesn't work, we tweak it, we try it again, and we keep iterating. It's not a one and done activity. We use representations. These are things like quick sketches or quick ideas to share and communicate. And then another big component of how we learn and how we gain knowledge through design is the idea of reflection. So looking back on what we've done and saying, hey, how did that go? How did that work? What would I do differently if I did this again in the future? And I think many of us are also familiar with that. We just maybe haven't called it that in the future. We maybe haven't addressed it explicitly, but I think reflection is something that many librarians engage in. Design is rooted in making, and so unlike science, which relies on inductive and deductive reasoning, think, right, like your Sherlock Holmes kind of evidence, design relies on what we call abductive reasoning, bringing a bunch of different parts together to synthesize and make something new. And then because design is, again, different, we have different ways of evaluating how well or not our designs are working. So we look to things like rationale. What are the reasons that we created this particular chair or this particular classification system or this particular database? And does it align with those reasons and those motivations? We might seek some critique and some feedback. We could seek it from experts in that space. Maybe I'm going to show my classification system to an expert and see what they think, but also from users as well. And I think lots of folks are probably familiar with that. User surveys, asking people for feedback on their programs, right? All of that is a form of critique. Design's interested in novelty, creating new things, solving problems in new ways. And new doesn't necessarily mean, the brand new shiny iPhone, right? Look at what are we on iPhone like 14 now, right? The iPhone 14 is new. It's a new iteration, right? So I think people sometimes get intimidated by the idea that design has to be novel. It just has to be novel in your particular context. And I've seen some incredibly novel things in libraries recently. Libraries of things where people can check out, cake pans and sewing machines, book bikes, right? All of those things I think are really fun implementations of design in libraries. And then thinking about, innovation in the same way. And basically also, how relevant is it to your users? I mean, a book bike is a really cool thing, But if your users are widely dispersed and you can't reach them on a bicycle, then maybe that's not the best design for your context. So that's a quick overview of sort of the fundamentals of design, but I want to talk specifically next about repertoire in design, since that's what we're going to focus on today. So repertoire is this idea that it's a set of previous experiences and bodies of knowledge. So it's something that we build over time, and it's how we gain knowledge. We did something before, we learned from that experience, and we carry that forward with us as we encounter new experiences and bring that to bear. So Donald Schoen is a major scholar of design, and he defines repertoire as this capacity to see unfamiliar situations as familiar ones, right? So when we encounter something we haven't seen before, we are comparing and contrasting it with familiar situations that we've encountered in the past. So that way we can bring those past experiences to bear on whatever this new unique case is. No matter how unique it is, there's something from our past that is affecting our perspective on the current situation. Other scholars have also defined repertoire, right? Almendra and Christians call it the reuse of knowledge that's capitalized either within the same project that you're working on or other projects in the past, but also notice they might not be your own projects. They could be other projects that you have encountered out in the world. And I think something really important that, for example, Lloyd and Snelders point out, that they've studied designers, but that repertoire is not necessarily specific to your past design experiences. It's basically everything in the world that you encounter. And they give a really lovely example of like Philippe Starck. He's an industrial designer, and he came up with this design. I think it was for a colander. And he came up with the design because he was eating calamari at lunch, and it was the shape of the calamari that inspired this design of his colander. So this idea that everywhere you go, everything you look at, everything you're taking in the world, in the grocery store, when you're watching Netflix, whatever it is you're doing, you're taking that in and you're building that into a body of knowledge that you can draw on. And so we actually thought, wow, that sounds like something that reference librarians kind of do. I think back to my experience when I worked as a reference librarian, or at least did some reference shifts when I worked as a cataloging librarian. This idea that we would often answer questions based on our previous knowledge. It wasn't a clean slate every time someone came to the reference desk to ask a question. So I got really interested in sort of how are library workers using this repertoire knowledge? And so specifically in this study, which I'm very grateful that RUSA, the Reference and User Services Association from the American Library Association, gave us funding to do this study, we wanted to look at two specific questions. The first is sort of, what was the scope and diversity of reference workers' repertoire knowledge, right? How big is their repertoire? How wide is it? How broad is it? What are all the different kinds of knowledge that they're capturing in their repertoire? And then in what ways, if any, do reference workers build that repertoire? Are they doing anything explicitly to build it? What are things they might be doing passively to build it? And especially with the aim of helping people down the line build and hone their repertoire. So that's the questions that we were interested in answering. I'm going to turn it over to Leah, who's going to talk about the actual study that we did.
Thank you so much. So to start with, our study was conducted by participants self-selecting in the study. So we sent out kind of a call for this study on social media and various listservs. And then once participants self-selected, they completed a survey. After the survey, we did an onboarding interview, just talking about what the process was going to be like. And then after that, they started actually doing the majority of the work, which was logging and ranking every reference interaction that they had for 4 weeks. So it was a lot of work. We're very, very grateful to all of our participants because on a busy day when you get a lot of interactions, this is a lot of work. So we really appreciate that. For that logging, we asked them to use something called the Reed scale, which was developed by Dr. Gerlich to rank the difficulty. It's a ranking system from 1 to 6, 1 and 2 being things like directional questions, can I borrow a pen? And then 3, when you started actually kind of using some of that knowledge to answer questions, going all the way up to 6, which is like dissertation level, like really nitty gritty stuff. We also asked them for each interaction to give a little description and to focus on the question itself. Obviously, the patron interactions also came into play, but we were looking at the reference knowledge. At the end of each week, we sent out yet another survey, collecting all of the answers that they had that were, or all of the questions they had that were 3 and above, and asking them to reflect on it. Reflect on how they collaborated with coworkers, where they found answers, what questions were hardest and easiest, and also which questions were just fun. After those 4 weeks, we then sat down and did about an hour-long final interview with every participant just to go over their reflections, their questions, to ask further in-depth questions about how they did their reference interviews, how they view reference, and more. And it was really, really insightful. So thanks, Jean, for putting the Reed scale in there. I really appreciate that. It's a great scale for anybody who needs one for reference, but I'm particular because I like it. So just an overview of our participants. To start with, we had 51 people self-select to join our study. From that, we had 20 people onboarded and 18 who finished up the study. Over this time, we had over 1,000 reference questions logged, which is pretty incredible. And we had 72 weekly reflections completed. So we had a lot of really great data to pull from. Now, just to kind of talk a little bit about who our participants were. So our participants, we tried to get as broad of a geographic variety as we could, but again, since it was self-selected, this is kind of where we ended up. We had different community types, library types, and job titles. Our community types we split into rural, suburban, and urban, and this was all identified by the participant. Library types, we didn't want to just look at reference in one library because reference can be done in so many. So we had 7 academic, 10 public, and 1 other who actually worked for a government library. For our job titles, again, anybody who was doing reference, so we had professional staff, librarians, and also a manager and director. For our service population size, most libraries fell within that 10,000 to about 50,000 population size, but we did have some larger libraries as well as some smaller libraries. And then just to capture as many reference questions as we could, we wanted to kind of skew to people who were on the reference desk more frequently. But you can see we even had people who were on the reference desk, for only 5 to 10 hours a week. That, I think, if I remember right, at least one of those was our professional staff who weren't full time. We had some people who were on the reference desk for the entirety of their staff hours. And then now I'm going to hand it over to Marissa, who's our other colleague on this project.
Sure, thanks, Leah. So through our process, we were able to identify some common themes. Throughout the 4-week period of our study, our participants' interactions required them to use their personal repertoires. The themes we've identified through our interviews show how the use of repertory knowledge comes up in reference work. And the early themes we've identified are these ones here: importance of curiosity, collaborative institutional repertoire, that repertoire is not just subject or topic based, but comes up through interactions, and that reflection helps to build and think for the future. So before we dive a little further into these themes, we'll look at some data we collected through our interviews. So in our interviews, participants mentioned answering reference questions covering a diverse range of topics. The word cloud here shows some of the topics where our participants answered questions. It's a really big range here. We also learned about the educational and professional backgrounds of our participants, as well as their interests and hobbies. The bar chart here shows the diverse range of subjects in which our participants had received their non-LIS degrees. And again, you can see it really ranges. And that was the case with their interests as well. Some interests that were mentioned apart from reading, of course, included dog training, crafting, curling, murder, mystery, dinner theater, and that's just a few of them. And many participants said that apart from their MLIS degrees, Other degrees, interests, and professional experiences help them to answer reference questions.
Sorry, I'm toggling between windows. So just to start with, and sorry, just to say to kind of echo what Jean said in the chat, is again, this variety of different backgrounds also was shown in our little question we asked you at the beginning. So thank you for sharing all of your undergraduate degrees and backgrounds with us. We really appreciate that. It shows the variety of topics and knowledge that people bring into librarianship. So thank you. So to start with, one of the first things we ran into was just the importance of curiosity in reference work. And so with this, a lot of people talked about how curiosity was a huge motivating factor. You know, I really like the last quote where it's just taking time to explore, kind of doing a little scavenger hunt to see what's out there. We had people talk about how it was like a scavenger hunt, or how they were a sleuth, or how curiosity motivated them even after the reference interaction to go a little further, to do a little extra search, to learn a little bit more. I know I had one example, which there was somebody who was asked a question on some sort of gardening, and they went deeper into it. And sure enough, like a few weeks later, somebody else came in and they were able to share that knowledge. They also had a garden in the library, so they were able to use that with the library garden. So I think this importance of curiosity is a large motivating factor in doing reference work and learning.
So we also saw that repertoire is collaborative or institutional. Reference workers collaborate on questions big and small, mostly with coworkers, but also with patrons and members of the communities that they serve. We saw that it's common for reference workers to want to verify their answers and use coworkers as a touchstone or a sounding board. They want to give their patrons, oh, sorry, this is a different order. This is a different slide, I'm sorry. Or did we skip one? I'm just realizing the slide is different. Sorry, Leah.
That's me. No, it's okay. I hit the button and it hit it twice. There we go. Sorry about that, folks.
Right, now we got the right quotes. Thanks, Leah. Yeah, so they want to give their patrons an answer that's of the best quality possible. So if they had arrived at an answer they believed to be adequate, they went the next step further and wanted to get another perspective just to ensure that the strategies they used were sound and that no stone was left unturned. So checking in with coworkers in this way was a way to learn new things, like how to approach a search and what resources to use. So since many reference workers would go about the same search in completely different ways, a participant described how interesting it was to see their coworkers' go-to database, especially if it wasn't one they had used before or referred to infrequently. Reference workers also collaborated with colleagues when they knew that another person had expertise in a certain topic or subject area. So maybe a coworker is really into crafting or local history, something like that. So reference workers saw that it would be beneficial to get that person involved with the patron interaction as well. And maybe through that process, they would learn something about crafting or local history so they can answer the question the next time. So being exposed to new resources and different perspectives and being able to look into a colleague's repertoire allows reference workers to build their repertoire collaboratively. So repertoire does not only consist of subject expertise or familiarity with certain topics, but experience built through interactions. Interactions that include past successes and failures that have informed how reference interactions are handled and have helped build confidence over time. So this is kind of the iterative quality that Dr. Clark was talking about earlier. Interactions that help build repertoire might include things like a topic that gets asked about frequently. The reference worker in this case might already have relevant resources handy, or it might be an assignment for a course that gets run consistently. The reference worker might already be anticipating the common problems students may run into and be ready to help. Maybe they've already dealt with stressed out students before, and they have developed a way to effectively communicate with them and make their day a little better. Having experienced similar interactions and not just subjects allows reference workers to build on each interaction, seeing what works and doesn't work, and adding new tools to their tool belt that could be easily accessed again and again. Many of our participants found that the questions that were among the easiest to answer were questions that were asked most frequently. Reference workers become familiar with their community and they're serving, and through interactions are able to anticipate their needs through the use of their built repertoire.
And then another theme that came up was this idea of reflection, which again connects back to some of the other design elements that really epitomize design. And this idea that, as I think Leah mentioned earlier, people would think about the reference interactions long after they were over, and they might continue to follow that rabbit hole down, whether or not they thought it would come up in the future. It was just interesting to them. And lots of our participants talked about mulling over the question, how well it went or potentially didn't go, so that they could address that question or a similar situation. As Marissa mentioned, not everything was topical. There were also repertoire knowledge in how to interact or how to search or things like that. And so many of the reference workers we talked to did speak about sort of taking time to reflect, to help them do a better job in the future. Or as some people mentioned, sort of like the quote here, if they didn't think they handled it well, they would mull over it for the rest of eternity, right? Those questions that haunt you, those questions that you are still trying to find an answer to this day. I'm still, for instance, struggling with a question about the number of log cabins by state in the United States, and I'm still trying to track that one down. Can find it by region, but not by state, right? So those questions that haunt us, that sort of stick in our brain, that we are continually reflecting on, and every once in a while we might bump up against something that will help us move that forward. But also the fact that we're thinking about it and taking it in and sitting with it so that it is contributing to building that repertoire of knowledge.
Okay, great. So we're going to ask you, if you don't mind, typing some more stuff in the chat for us. In the chat, we'd love to hear about a fun fact that you've learned recently, preferably something not related to this conference or libraries. It could be anything about a hobby you picked up, wiki deep dive, something cool you saw in a video. Mine currently is the fact that for a long time we thought bats were really good at echolocation and they didn't crash into each other, but we actually just didn't have cameras that could see them crashing into each other, and they actually crash into each other all the time. So that's my fun fact that I learned recently. If y'all don't mind just putting in the chat, what's something fun you learned? Turkeys will eat apples left on trees. That's a good one. I didn't even know turkeys could reach the apples left on trees.
I was just going to ask. I didn't know they could reach. My goodness.
New way of
a new way of.
Oh, we might need to talk about that, Amanda. Possums eat ticks. That's a good one. Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeons and Dragons representing Wisconsin.
Oh, Megan said that the turkeys sit in the tree. How do they get to sit in the tree? Can turkeys fly? Oh, they can fly. Okay. I'm learning a lot of new things. Go say boo, because boo is Latin for I am yelling. Oh, well, I'm just going to yell boo at people now. Sorry, Rachel and Marissa, if that happens in a meeting. Bear actually isn't a word for bear. It's for the brown one. Canada, Rhode Island is not actually an island. Turkeys can fly, just not well. Okay, then I don't feel so bad for not knowing that turkeys could fly. I hope I haven't offended any turkeys. Amy, yeah, they did lie to you. I actually worked in Cincinnati for a while, and that always came up around Thanksgiving. Ooh, new illustrated version of Harry Potter. Oh, cool. Well, I've learned a lot. So thank you all. And hopefully you've learned something cool as well. And look we just expanded our repertoire. So way to go us. Give a pat on the back. Now I know if anybody asks me about turkeys, I know. Ooh, learning all about the Vosburgh Putney case. I don't know about that one. Really into hockey right now. Love that. We'll keep putting them in the chat. We're going to keep going, but keep expanding our repertoire. I'm learning so many new things. I hope you are too. And who knows, maybe a patron will ask about it. Oh, and the turkeys fall out of the tree when they walk down. Now I want to see that. Well, thank you everybody for sharing. So we kind of talked how we kind of just built each other's repertoire right now. But one of the things that came up in a lot of our discussions where many participants, kind of going with that curiosity, mentioned being lifelong learners. And so a lot of times things to expand their reference knowledge were things like webinars, like we're doing today, job trainings, conferences, reading. But we also wanted to talk about how else can we build our reference and our repertoire knowledge. So the first way, and I'm quite partial to this way, is finding the fun and designating time in your work life to explore and be curious. So that cool question that patron asked about how to make their grapes less acidic, dive deeper. The grape question actually came from one of our participants. She spent a while looking at it after that and learned some great facts for the next time somebody came and asked about grapes. Who knew grape farming was so exciting? The other thing that I think with finding the fun is playing around on the internet. So looking at NPR, New York Times, but also just playing around, looking at things like Twitter. And I'm going to say, yes, looking at library Twitter counts as work. I know Twitter is kind of on the down now, but library Twitter is still going strong, at least in my opinion. Also, there's such a conception that libraries, and librarians from the outside public world, that all we do is read all day. And while that's definitely not true, it is important to find time to read. With this reference study, we weren't just looking at reference questions. Our idea of reference questions, definition of that, expanded to things like reader's advisory. So if you're going to be a good reader's advisor, you need to be able to read books, to read library journal, to do all that stuff. Or I heard that earlier today, there was a great session on reader's advisory and nonfiction. You need time to read those nonfiction books to learn about how to make grapes less acidic, to learn about new knitting techniques that are faster, because those questions do come up. And so it's important to have time to play and explore and find the fun in your work. And so unfortunately, I know oftentimes there's not enough staff time to do that, but it is important. And so if there's this is my soapbox moment. If there's any managers out there, if you're able to give your staff time to read, to play on the internet, to do with all these things, it is very important.
So collaboration was another one that came up all the time. This is a great way to build repertoire. So getting to know what your colleagues are knowledgeable and passionate about, so you can learn about these topics yourself. I know just from working with Dr. Clark and Leah, I've learned so much about knitting and quilting and all these things I didn't know about before. So it's super cool. And I now have a new appreciation for these kind of things. So when you're confronted with a question about them, now you might know something about them and you're able to offer some expertise, or who to tell them to go to ask this type of question or to find the answer. So also organizations and individuals in your community have specific knowledge about what they do. So taking time to learn about different services and things that are around might also help add some tools to your belt. And then listening to patrons too. Patrons not only have their own passions and interests that you could learn about while you're helping them answer questions or look for items, but they might have also gone out in the community and tried some of these services, and they know what's good, what worked, and what didn't work. So you can learn from them too.
And then finally, again, another way of learning is through that reflection. And if I'm going to be on my soapbox, what I would like to say is moving this reflection from this implicit sort of tacit way that it's happening now, right? Again, I think this is something we all engage in, making it more explicit and making explicit time for it. Right, we're already doing things like thinking about the various difficulties of questions, right? Applying things like the read scale, and just thinking about that can be helpful in learning new ways to address reference or new ways to think about it. But I think what's really important here, right, in our culture of busy and our under-resourced libraries, right, we're always expected to look like we're working and do something. And Leah alluded to this as well, that we don't just sit around and read. We're always supposed to be doing something. And actually that time to sit and read is important. And that time to sit and reflect is important. And the problem is, from that exterior, it looks like you're doing nothing, right? I was a creative writing major. We were talking about, undergraduate studies before, and I'd be sitting on the couch looking like I was doing nothing. And my parents would be like, why aren't you doing anything? I'm like, I'm working. I'm thinking about the story that I'm going to write, right? Because it doesn't look like traditional work to other people. It's easy to dismiss, and it's easy to erase the time for it. And especially if there are any supervisors or managers in here, I think it's really important to allow your workers to have that explicit time to do this kind of thoughtful reflection. One of the things that came up in our interviews that was somewhat unexpected was participants stating how helpful the reflective pieces of the surveys that we sent them were, that they had never really explicitly sat down and thought about how they did reference, and that they felt they learned a lot through the process of participating in our study. And I think that just goes to show sort of how important this is. So we thought one thing that folks could do is many reference workers already track their stats, right? That's where the read scale is often used. How many reference questions were answered, what was the difficulty of those questions, but building in a more qualitative, reflective component to logging those reference questions, even if it's just short, just like we asked our participants to do. They said it was really helpful for them. And I think, if your library collects reference statistics in that way, just adding maybe one open-ended question asking, what did you learn from this question, or what might you do differently when answering this question in the future, could be potentially really beneficial for learning and building your repertoire.
So now we're going to ask you to go back to the chat one more time. In the nature and with the oh no, I can't think of the word, with kind of the feeling of reflection. There we go. How are you going to build your repertoire going forward? If you don't mind adding that in there, what's something that you're either going to continue to do more intentionally, something new you might try? If you could just share maybe from this presentation, what's something you want to do to build your repertoire going forward? I'm just going to give a little bit of time here for that. If you don't mind sharing with us. If not, if you don't want to share with us, put it in a notebook, put it on a Post-it, stick it on the wall to remind yourself. Oh, so we're reading a variety of books. That's always great. Flip through new books. Yeah, that's definitely good. I always like to read just the backs. There's never enough time. That is so true. Podcasts, that's a great way to do it. Trivia games and nonfiction reading. Universal class, that's really great. Time to explore and be curious. Love that. Sometimes exploring and being curious can just be as much as like walking up and down an aisle and just really looking at the book spines. No longer feel guilty about a rabbit hole on Wikipedia. Do not. That is one of my favorite activities. Love Wikipedia. Great. More intentional reflection on questions. Learn and reflect widely. Yes. Be more mindful about what I'm doing might be useful. Yes. Yes. What you're doing is definitely useful. And while not everything you do in your free time has to be work, that stuff can still inform your work, which I think is so important. Great.
Yeah, and I appreciate the person who said designating time. Not that I want to be, super regimented about it, but in the past I've done things like I just mark like half an hour on my calendar. and that maybe I'll use that time to also go and get a coffee, but I'll use that time, right? And I think that helps sort of make that work more visible to your coworkers, to your managers, to your boss. And like, it's not a coffee break. I'm not slacking off. Like, I'm actually doing legitimate work here.
That reminds me of a good example. One time it was opening and I didn't have any opening duties that day. So I was on Twitter looking at library stuff going on. And one of my coworkers came behind me and they're like, "Why are you on social media? You're at work." And I was like, "Because I'm reading about the latest." I think at that point it was something going on with HarperCollins. And so it was really important. And then after that, I was reading about, I'm a romance reader. I was reading about, what romance novels had come out, what people thought about them and all of that. So I think that's really great, that intentionality.
Yeah, and I also see like intentionally diversifying your reading. I love those like little bingo cards, right? We do it for patrons all the time, right? We encourage them to diversify their reading. Like we should practice what we preach. That's something that I've been trying to do lately as well.
Yeah, that's something I'm doing too. I'm a PhD student. As a PhD student, as I'm trying to learn more about what my colleagues are doing, not even in the library field, just to learn. So I'm asking them to give me like an article I think I could understand.
And Jean, I think that's so important. Giving yourself permission to do this can be the hardest thing. And if nothing else comes out of this work that we've done, my biggest goal is to help with that, right? We anticipate publishing a research piece about this, and then ideally you could take that piece to your manager and say, "Look, here's proof that I need explicit time to do some reading as part of my job. Here's proof that reflection is valuable and I should have time in my work week to do that." So one of the goals of this project is that you shouldn't have to be the one advocating for that permission. We want to have this research that you can use to do that for yourself and again for your context as well.
Okay, thanks everyone. And if anybody else wants to keep going with this, please feel free to. And yes, we'll let you know when it gets published. So with this, we just want to thank Wild Wisconsin for having us today. And we also want to thank, again, Rachel mentioned this before, but the Reference and User Services Association for giving us a grant to do this work. And now we want to open up for any questions. I think the first question we already got during this thing while people are thinking of questions is, can we get a copy of the reflective questions?
We can definitely share a copy of the reflective questions that we asked our participants. We'll coordinate with Jean and the Wild Wisconsin folks for the best ways of distributing them, but we can certainly share copies of that.
That would be great. You can send them to me. We have a place on the Wild Wisconsin website for where all the conference resources will be, like this, the slides and the recording from today. So we can add them to that page. So
Perfect.
that would be awesome. Thank you. I was thinking about this. I was a reference librarian for many years before I started working at the systems, and I would keep track of the reference questions and whatnot. So I am really, really curious about the read scale, because one of the things on most libraries' annual reports is they have to do a count of reference questions. And I think it's really important at times, like a couple times during the year, maybe to do something like this where you keep track in a more deep isn't the right word, but a more, where you track the types of questions and whatnot, and then maybe that's an opportunity once a quarter or once every, twice a year to do something like this for libraries and for reference staff and things like that. So I think this is really cool. I also had a question. When you were talking about increasing the repertoire of your colleagues, would you also think of this as like your organization's repertoire? Like when you were talking about getting to know individuals of, your colleagues and whatnot, I was thinking of it as a way to also build those relationships between your colleagues. And that's one of the things you find out is what's their repertoire, what are their knowledge, things to be able to share.
Marissa, do you want to speak to that one?
Sure. Yeah, so I think, yeah, it's kind of similar to that idea of the repertoire being institutional. Like you kind of get to know your coworkers and you take that time, which I think that could be another way to invest and be in something else to be intentional about is, let me go talk to this person and learn about like what they care about and what they've been reading and all of these types of things. So I think just having like the awareness like is the tool. So even if you're unfamiliar with it, like I gave the example of knowing more about some of these fiber arts from Leah and Dr. Clark, I probably couldn't answer a question that well, but I'm aware that they have the knowledge and they can use their expertise. And I know, and maybe I can answer some shorter, easier questions at the top. But yeah, I think that's really cool about the collaboration because it is really that thing like two heads are better than one, three heads are better than one, and then you have everybody there. So that in itself is a whole another repertoire with everybody's personal repertoire added together. I think, let me know if that answers the question.
I think so. It makes me think of all these connections that you have, both at the personal level and at the library level. And then beyond that, it's like, I might not know the answer, but I know somebody who does, kind of thing.
Just to speak to that too, we had a great example of somebody doing something like that. They were part of like different community groups on Facebook, and somebody asked a question about something happening in the library, and they're like, that's not us. But they're like, but I think I know who. And so they looked at these different community partners that they have, like, the park district and the library, one city over and all that. And were able to find this event this person was looking for and was hoping that their library was doing, but they were able to direct them to the right place. And so that's just one example. I see Carla asked, as read scale part of the slides we can look at. And just for that, I put in the Read Scale website, but we also made a little cheat sheet, which I'm sure we can share with Jean. And then we have a question from Katie saying, curious how others balance service. Excuse me, let me try this again. Curious how others balance reference services of finding an answer or item versus teaching research skills. Our library has to be particularly thoughtful about this as we support students with assignment work. Dr. Clark, do you want to tackle this one?
Yeah, it's not something that we explicitly asked about. Like how much time do you spend teaching versus sort of finding the answer? I think it implicitly came up in some of our conversations about the difficulty levels and on that read scale, because as they increase in difficulty, they do tend to become sort of more instructional help many times. Recalling from the interviews, I do think I remember some of our participants also struggling with the same thing, and sometimes defaulting to answering because they had answered that way in the past. But these tended to be, I would say, more basic assignment questions, right? Like obviously not giving answers for a research paper, things like that. But it did come up, and people did note the struggle, but it wasn't a specific focus of what we were asking about. So I don't know that we have as much to say in that space. I would say extrapolating from some of the responses from folks, both in the surveys and in the interviews, I think repertoire could also be drawn upon here, right? How do we learn to teach? I was actually just talking with another doctoral student before this meeting. How did I learn to teach? My background's in creative writing. I don't have any formal teaching experience. I learned from the experiences that I encountered, both as a student, but then as a teacher watching other people teach. And I flat out told her, I'm like, I crib ideas from other people, right? And that's building my repertoire when I see someone do a particular teaching activity, right? So when I was learning to do reference and I saw somebody turn the screen and ask a student at the desk, like, hey, let's search this together. What's a keyword you might use to search for this topic? And I was like, wow, that's kind of cool that they're not just doing it for them, that they're engaging with them, but it's also scaffolded and supported. And that's something that I learned just in the moment and put into my repertoire. So I think some of the concepts that we're talking about here are certainly applicable. Yeah, and I see Julie pointing out in the chat, don't rebuild the wheel, right? I'm definitely a fan of what I call sort of working smarter, not harder. So learn from what's out there. I think it applies to teaching in reference interactions as well.
I appreciate also Jean saying that having a name for what we do regularly is validating to daily work. That's the hope of this study. So I'm glad to hear that. And also to Katie's point as well, if anybody else deals with this, how do you deal with it? You can drop that in the chat. We'd love to, hear that as well. It is kind of a fine line and a hard balance.
And to Jean's point, definitely one of the goals here is making this more explicit, and naming something helps make it more explicit. And for me, it's not just about repertoire, but all of those concepts in design. So thinking about librarianship as more of this design space of us as being creators and having the power to create. This is the kind of work we've always been doing, but we never called it that. We never thought about it that way. What could we learn from looking at it from this new perspective? What can we learn by giving it these names and exploring these concepts in more depth? So yeah, we've been talking about repertoire here, but we've also been talking about reflection, which I think is another concept that we all do, but we didn't necessarily put a name to it, to validate it, to make space for it in our work, to put it on our calendars, right? All of those things. So I think there's actually quite a bit from the design space that's applicable here.
Morgan says another term used in design is demographics, which librarians call community.
They would also, I think, say users, right? There's that debate. Are they users? Are they patrons? Are they customers? Right.
Definitely. I'm just going to double check and see if we missed any questions. I don't think we did. I think Leah was keeping a good eye on those as well. We do have a few minutes left if anyone has any questions for Rachel, Leah, or Marissa. This is your time to do it. Otherwise, I will just let you know we, as I mentioned in the beginning, we are recording this. So the recording along with the slides and the other information that Rachel and Leah and Marissa will send me will be put on the post-conference resource page of Wild Wisconsin, and we'll put the link to that in the chat as well. And you'll get a follow-up email with that probably tomorrow, I think. Thanks, Angela. I knew you would have the link at hand to do that. So we'll wait just another minute if anyone has any other questions.
Yes.
And if you have any other quirky facts about turkeys, you can definitely put those in the chat.
Yes.
Also, here's our contact if you have anything further you'd like.
Thank you. Some people are sharing some repertoire building podcasts. So thank you for sharing those too. I will, again, compile all of the chats into a couple of lists afterwards and share those as well.
We do have a good final question that maybe either Dr. Clark or Marissa can tackle. What is a specific difference between repertoire versus skill or knowledge?
Yeah, I think that's actually a really great question. And going back to some of those design scholars who've talked about repertoire, I would say they're not different. I see it more as like a Venn diagram, like repertoire is a form of knowledge and it might have skills within it. So I'm envisioning sort of nested circles, but I think sort of the two characteristics that make repertoire, one is that it's a body of knowledge, right? So it's not just one particular skill, but it's a giant set, and it just keeps getting bigger the more quirky turkey facts that we learn. And the second is that it really is about these past experiences and the combination, right? Not just that these past experiences exist, right? I have knowledge in my brain, like I know that turkeys fall out of trees and eat apples, but how am I bringing that to bear on the current situation? And I would say right now, I'm not actually bringing that turkey fact to bear except to make terrible jokes. But in the moment, if I'm at a reference desk and it comes up, right, that's when I can really say I'm drawing on this past knowledge to apply to this current situation. I would definitely say it's not a hard and fast boundary, right? Repertoire is a form of knowledge. And so, but I think it has to go in sort of that past storage and then be brought back again. I'm not a cognitive scientist, so I don't think I can get into sort of more detail than that. But that's sort of the way that I think about it.
Julie also put in the chat kind of an answer to summarize, which I think is really nice. Repertoire is being able to use skills and knowledge you have to synthesize knowledge and share with others. So thank you, Julie, for that definition.
I really like the use of the word synthesize there, right? It's that bringing together. So it's bringing together the past, combining it with whatever's going on in the present and shaping it.
I also now have a bunch of new podcasts. And I learned that otters have pockets where they keep stones.
All sorts of new things, otters and turkeys and everything today. That's awesome.
From otters to turkeys. You know?
Yes,
That's reference work though, right? Going from otters to turkeys in a second.
it is. You never know what you're going to learn. And Catherine says, see otters sleep holding hands so they don't float apart. Yes, I do remember seeing that one. Thank you, Catherine. All right. We are almost at the hour mark, 3:27. So I'm not seeing, I think we got all the questions. Leah, correct me if I'm wrong. And Angela, I think you addressed all of them. I love that we're going to keep getting more facts, and I am going to compile this and put it out there for us probably on Friday. So thank you so much, Dr. Clark, Leah, and Marissa for that great session and all that great information. We really appreciate it. There will be a short survey at the end of the webinar and will also be sent to you in your email afterwards. We really appreciate your feedback. This was our last session for today. We will begin at 9 a.m. tomorrow with tracks in both marketing and sustainability. Registration for these sessions continues to be open. So thanks for joining us and have a great rest of your day.